So then with that bodhicitta motivation in mind, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I'm just gonna see all no, we're on the text on tenets, right? We're in the middle section on the middle way school, the Majjhimaka, and we're on the autonomous or svatantrika subset of the Majjhimaka. And last time we covered, I guess, the first three of the seven headings for the svatantrikas. And I point this out last time, right? That for all the other tenet systems, there were seven headings for each of the, for each tenet system. And here it's the same seven, but the difference here is with Majjhimaka, you go through the seven for the autonomy school, then you go through the seven again for the prasangika, for the consequentialist school. So anyway, we're on the section on the autonomous, the svatantrikas. And so we covered the first three. So we're up to the number 4, the fourth heading, which is the way of asserting objects. And so here it starts, right, with existence by way of its own characteristics, existence from its own side, and inherent existence are equivalent. And so the saying for this school, for the svatantrikas, those terms, right, are synonyms, you could say, right? And one thing I want to point out, just to remind, we talked about this a bit last time, but I want to point out to remind everybody or clarify, right, that for this school, right, those three things, right, existence by way of its own, which are synonyms, right? So things do exist, right? So this is describing a way in which things do in fact exist from this school's perspective, right? So things do exist by way of their own characteristics. Things do have an existence from their own side. Things do have an inherent existence, right? I'm pointing that out for a few reasons. One is from the prasangika's perspective, actually, it's an interesting point. From the prasangika's perspective, those three things would also be synonyms, right? But a prasangika would say those three things are synonyms and do not exist. They're not the way things are, right? This school says those three things are synonyms and it is the way things are. Does that make sense? So that's a difference. That's why they're pointing that out, is that's a difference between the svatantrikas and the prasangikas. Yeah. I'm going to just point out one more thing about that. I mentioned this last time, I just wanted to mention it again because I think it'll help just if you're reading a text and so on, in these schools, is from a prasangika perspective, true existence would be another synonym, right, to those three terms. Like, so for things from a prasangika's perspective, things being truly existent and being inherently existent have the same meaning. Obviously, from the svatantrika school's perspective, those do not have the same meaning, right? Because a svatantrika would say things are inherently existent, but are not truly existent, right? So I just want to point this out, that things, a svatantrika would say things do have existence from their own side, but they don't have true existence. So those are not synonyms. So true existence and those three terms are not synonyms from the perspective of a svatantrika. Because remember, from a Svatantrika's perspective, nothing is truly existent. There are no truly existent phenomena. But there are phenomena that have existence from their own side. There are phenomena that have inherent existence. So that's the Svatantrika's view, and I think that's why that's part of why anyway. These three terms come up here. Is this point? It's really we're studying tenets, so it's differentiating these tenets from other tenets. Yeah. Okay. Then the next sentence, I guess you call it sentence. I guess each sentence is like its own paragraph. So it says, uncompounded space, true cessations, the past and the future, and the subtle selflessness of persons are both non-affirming negatives and conventional truths. So I want to point out a couple of things about this, right? This sentence. One is, remember what's a non-affirming negative, right? I just want to remind a non-affirming negation, right? Because that's going to come up for the autonomous and also for the prasangikas. So a non-affirming negation is a negation that does not imply some other positive phenomena, right? So I said this before, I think, but I just want to make sure people understand it, that there are two types of negations. There are in Buddhist logic. There are affirming negations and non-affirming negations. So a typical affirming negation would be like if I were to say, if I were to say, let's think of a true statement. I don't go to my job in the mornings, and I put in a lot of hours last week, right? Or the typical example they give is so and so, this person doesn't eat in the morning, but he gained a lot of weight, right? So it implies he ate in the evening, right? If I say I worked hard last week, but I take off mornings, it implies, I didn't say I work afternoons, but it's implied, or evenings, but it's implied, right? That I work some other time of day. So an affirming negation negates something while implying something else. A non-affirming negation negates something while not implying anything else. So that's one point, right? So the example of uncompounded space, right? The definition of uncompounded space in Buddhism is, what is it? Like you say, that which lacks obstruction, right? So it's merely that which lacks obstruction, right? And that's the definition of what uncompounded space is. So it's a negation. Yeah, and that's the nature of that phenomena. It's a negative phenomena, you say, right? It's not implying that it is something other than the lack of obstruction or lack of physical matter. So one thing I want to point out then about this sentence, though, that's kind of unique in a sense, is it includes, right, the subtle selflessness of persons. So that's a non-affirming negation means what, right? So the subtle selflessness of persons, according to this school, is the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. That is the subtle selflessness of persons, according to this school, right? So when we say there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self, that's a negation, right? And it doesn't imply that there is some other thing like a soul or a permanent being or some other thing, right? So that it's a non-affirming negation. So it makes sense that that's a negation, right? But I want to point out, it also says these things are conventional truths, right? So it's interesting, isn't it, that from this school's perspective, the selflessness of persons is not an ultimate truth. I just want to point out that's a unique point of this tenet system. And what's worth noting there is, for the Svatantrikas, only the emptiness of phenomena is an ultimate truth. So the lack of true existence, other words, for this school, the ultimate truth is the lack of true existence of phenomena. So that's why they say even the selflessness of persons is categorized as conventional truth in this tenet system. So that's what that means there. So uncompounded space is a conventional truth, right? It's a conventionally existing phenomena, but it's not an ultimate. The true cessations are conventional truths. And by the way, again, I think part of the reason to point this out is from for the Prasangikas, true cessations are ultimate truths because they're emptinesses. In this school, they're considered conventional truths. Anyway, so the subtle selflessness of persons is a conventional truth in this school, not an ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is the lack of true existence of phenomena. Okay. So I think those are the key points there. And then it's explained a little more here. Actually, that's explained in more detail in the next sentence on page 22, where it says, ultimate truth, final reality, and the subtle selflessness of phenomena are equivalent, right? So that makes that clear, right? The only thing, the only ultimate truth is the subtle selflessness of phenomena, according to the school. What is the selflessness of phenomena? It's the lack of true existence of phenomena, right? And so that's this school. Again, that's a unique tenet of the autonomy school. And then I'll just finish this section and then we'll pause for questions. Then it says, Sutra middle way autonomists assert that the 5 sense objects, forms and so on, meaning sound, smell, taste, touch, and so on, are different entities from consciousness. They are gross external objects composed of, I think this should say particles. It explains that below, where it says partless particles. Here it says partless particles, and I actually think personally, I'm not unique in this. Some of the Geshe's commenting, and you can see the footnote also points out Jamyang Shepa would disagree with partless particles. So I think it should say gross external objects composed of particles, because I think Jetson Chogi Gelson maybe is either a mistranslation or an error there or something, because really Svatandrika Madhyamikas don't assert partless particles. They assert particles, external particles if they're sutra followers, but not partless particles, because a partless particle would be truly existent, and this school doesn't accept true existence. There was one author who said they're partless. I mean, I'll just share this. I mean, so it looks like this footnote points out that Jamyang Shepa, who's a great Gelugpa scholar, would disagree with that sentence, that partless word of it just. And one Geshe, I think in his commentary, said he thought that was an error. It should be particles, not partless. Another Geshe said they could be partless. I think they were trying, I think personally, this is just my own opinion, but I think is that sometimes if it's your Geshe from Sarah J, then you have to find a way to defend your textbook of Sarah J, because they do that in the debate, when they debate, they are always debating, and they want to, each one, if you're from, say, Sarah J and you're debating with monks from Sarah May or from Drepung or Ganden, then one thing the monks do is they always wanted to kind of, when they're young, they want to defend the position of their textbook. So, Jamyang Shepa, I think, would be like an author, I think, from maybe Drepung. So if somebody from Drepung were saying that's wrong, of course, then a monk from Sarah J might want to defend it. So then anyway, one Geshe said, well, they are partless particles, they're just not spatially partless, which I don't know what that means even exactly. So I think you just try to find a person. I mean, he may be right, actually, I'm not sure, but it's my own, when I read that, I think he's just defending his textbook because he's loyal to Jetson Chogi Gelson. But I'm not really sure. But anyway, the point here really is that I'm just sort of, you will find that though. And actually, I'll just say one other, actually, I'm just going to go off on a very small tangent here. Just I think I found it useful. You may find it useful also. On this point, right? Like, I remember one time, it wasn't this book, but we were studying, we were actually studying, it was a text with Gyume Khenpo Rinpoche was teaching Pabonka Rinpoche's Vajrayogini commentary. And we came to a point where Pabonka Rinpoche said something, and Pabonka Rinpoche is this great scholar, right, and great master, and very respected with tradition. Anyway, so there was a sentence, and then Gyume Khenchen Rinpoche kind of said, well, this sentence disagree, like the Panchen Lama would disagree, the first Panchen Lama, Losing Chogi Gelsen, would disagree with this sentence. He says such and such. What do you think? And so we started having a discussion. And let's see, say this right. I could sort of, I don't know. It's hard to think. I think, let's see, say this right. Losing Chogi Gelsen, the first Panchen Lama, is considered one of the great, apart from Tsongkhapa himself, he's considered as respected a master, and the Kali traditions exist. So anyway, so in the end, I came to the conclusion, I disagreed with Pabonka Rinpoche's sentence, and I remember I had this conversation with Tashi, Khenchen, some of you know Tashi, he's Khenchen Rinpoche's, he's a Geshe, who's very close, he takes care of Khenchen Rinpoche. And I said to Tashi, well, how do you think about that? And Tashi was very sweet, because about sentences like this, he said, oh, I'm always so grateful, to the masters who add a sentence like that. He said, because those are the ones, he said, then I don't forget that point. He said, if they say something, if someone who I really respect says something, and then in the end I think it's wrong, he says, then I'll always remember that point, because I had to think, well, why is that way? And you have to really think deeply. And he said, so I think really good teachers sometimes make mistakes to help us learn a point better, because then you have to really think. And then he said, and then also, Khenchen Rinpoche pointed out, and then he said, and then you have to think as you're reading, otherwise you can just read in this passive way, like somebody, I don't know, like an animal eating, you can read like a cow eating grass or something, right? You're just not really paying attention, or where they were pointing out, then you have to think deeply, right? You have to really analyze, well, do I agree or do I disagree, and why? And then I noticed, even Gyume Khenchen Rinpoche sometimes will say two different things, and then later we'll say, well, what do you think? And then sort of force you to make you think. So I think there's something very useful about these kinds of sentences. Ever since Tashi made that comment, I find that I'm like, well, why would it? So actually, it's all because they have to stop and think, well, why would Sutra middle way autonomists follow Sautantrikas? Sautantrikas would assert a partless particle, right? So you have to pause and think, well, why would a Sutra middle way autonomous Madhyamaka not assert a partless particle, right? Is there a way of asserting a partless particle while still denying that it's truly existent, right? And is there a way to assert a partless particle that's logically, because also if you look at the writings of, say, Baba Viveka, who's the most important of the Sutra middle way autonomists, right? He's someone who relies on deep reasoning. And so if you think, well, how could you assert a spatially partless particle, right? Because for one thing, how could they, there's many arguments, right? How could they aggregate, right? If it's spatially partless, then how, but if things are formed of aggregations of those, how can one be on the right and one be on the left if there's no spatial direction to the particle, right? And so it makes you have to think, well, why couldn't a Madhyamaka assert a spatially partless particle? So I think then it makes you actually, so I just want to pause, that we can just skip over this thing and say, oh, maybe he made a mistake and move on. But I actually think it's useful to pause and think about those kind of points and say, well, why would that be the case, or why would that not be the case, right? Why do I disagree with the Sautantrikas on that? And if you're a Madhyamaka, what you have to say, I think for my own, this is my own position now, I would say, well, wait a second, if you're a Madhyamaka, you deny true existence, right? And how could you, that's my own feeling, how could you assert a spatially partless particle that's not truly existent? So here we go back. So really what we're saying then, I think, at least my view, would be that Sutra middle way autonomists do assert external objects. They do assert that consciousness and the objects they perceive are not of one entity, but are separate entities, right? And that those external objects are made up of matter, right? They're not in the nature of mind, which is what Chitamatrans assert. So I think that's what's important to understand. And then the author contrasts that, right, with yogic middle way autonomous, right? Where those are the Svatantrika Majjhamikas, whose views on conventional truth accord with the mind-only school, right? Yogacara. Yogic means Yogacara, which for Gelugpa would be a synonym for Chittamatrin. Most scholars in all the traditions agree that Yogacara and Chittamatra are synonyms. There are some, I think, scholars who say there might be slight differences, but most agree that Yogacara and Chittamatra are synonyms. So a yogic middle way autonomous, right? Those are the Svatantrika Majjhamikas, who, when they look at conventional reality, mainly follow the Chittamatran doctrines on conventionalities. So they assert that the 5 sense objects, form and so forth, are of one entity with the consciousness apprehending them. So that's a key difference. I'm just pointing out, right? That's a key difference among these autonomous. That's a key difference between those two sub-schools of autonomous, right? Because again, the Sutra middle way autonomists, when they discuss conventional reality, mainly follow Svatantrika, so they say external objects are a different entity from the mind. Yogacara middle way autonomous, or Yogacara Svatantrikas, say that mainly follow the Chittamatrans, and so they say that there are no external objects that are of different nature of mind. Everything is of one, mind and the object of mind are of one entity or one nature. Yeah. And so you can see here, I just want to point out, right? So this way of asserting objects, really what this author is doing here, he's not going to go through an extremely comprehensive explanation of their ways of asserting objects, because what he's mainly getting at is, well, if the Sutra followers mainly assert external objects in this way, their explanation, apart from some small details regarding true existence, their explanation of objects is mainly in accordance with the Sutra, Svatantrikas, and the Yogacara, Svatantrika Majjhamikas, the yogic middle way autonomous. He's not going to explain all the details of their way of asserting external objects, or rather of objects, because mostly their way of asserting objects accords with the Chittamatrans. So we've already explained that. It's kind of what he's implying here. So that's why now, he's pointed out like a few of the unique features of the Svatantrikas in terms of how they assert objects. And then he says these 2 paragraphs here as a way of pointing out that most of the details for these, the rest of this would be similar to those other, so either the Svatantrikas or the Chittamatrans. I'll just pause there for a second and ask if there are questions about that before I go on to the next heading. And I think that, again, because a lot of that point heading is similar to those other schools. And to some extent, the same thing is going to be true for the next heading, number 5, the way of asserting object possessors. To a large extent, this is going to be similar to lower schools, so he's going to point that out, and then he's going to really, I think what Jetsun Chogyeltsen does here is he points out the similarities to either the Svatantrika or the Chittamatrans, and then he points out some differences, right? The unique features. There are some unique features on these topics. So, but the first thing we'll start with, the mental consciousness is asserted to be the illustration of the person, right? So remember, every school, right, has what we've called an illustration of a person, right? Which means, like, in the end, what do you point at as the person, right? That goes from life to life. And so for Svatantrika Majjhamikas, it's the mental consciousness. And we said this before, I'll just point out, right? Some of the lower schools, some of them would say it's the 5 aggregates, right? Some would say it's the consciousness. One school said it's the alaya vijnana, right? The alaya, the storehouse consciousness, right? Who said that? Do you remember? Which obviously it's a Chittamatran sub-school, but which Chittamatran sub-school was it? Who gets? I'll say it's the Chittamatrans who follow scriptures, not those who follow reasoning. Yeah, right. They say it's that the illustration of the person is the alaya, or the storehouse consciousness. So so each Buddhist school has to, when they talk about what goes from life to life, what's the repository of karma, they talk about an illustration of the person, or that which you can point to as the person. And probably the most common answer is the answer the Svatantrika has come up with, which is it's the mental consciousness. Right? We're going to get into this later. I'll just point out that again, the Prasangikas are unique in many ways. The Prasangikas are unique because what they say is the illustration of the person is the merely labeled, is that which is merely labeled by the mind. Right? That's a unique position. They're the only ones who say that. Prasangikas have a lot of unique positions actually because they're extremely subtle. But anyway, from the Svatantrika's perspective, it's the illustration of the person is the mental conscious, and that's true for both the Sutra followers and the yogic. So the Svatantrika Madhyamikas and the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamikas, they all agree that it's the mental consciousness. They assert the collection of six. They all assert a collection of six consciousnesses. I want to point out an implication of that, by the way. So what that's really implying here, one is, it's not surprising that the Sutra following autonomists assert six consciousnesses because they accord with Svatantrika, and Svatantrikas assert six consciousnesses. But I'll ask another question. Why is it that the yogic middle way autonomists assert six consciousnesses? And again, I'm just pointing out, pause and think about it, right? Because there are two sub-schools of Chittamatrans, right? One asserts six consciousnesses. Those are the Chittamatrans who follow reasoning. There's another sub-school that we went over of the Chittamatrans who assert eight consciousnesses. Those are the Chittamatrans who follow scripture. Right? And I'm just pointing out that, so you could pause here and go, when it says they assert a collection of six consciousnesses, that includes the yogic middle way autonomists. That means that the yogic middle way autonomists on this topic follow the Chittamatrans who follow reasoning, not those who follow scripture, right? Because so they don't assert, so that these yogic middle way autonomists don't assert, what it's saying here is they don't assert the alaya, and they don't assert the afflicted consciousness, right? The klistamanas. They don't assert those two. Remember that the Chittamatrans who follow scripture are unique in that they assert the six consciousness plus the alaya, right? The storehouse consciousness, and the afflicted consciousness, or the klistamanas, I think let's pronounce it. So these yogic middle way autonomists don't assert those two extra consciousnesses. Those are only asserted by the Chittamatrans following scripture. And so also, I'm just pointing out something then. So if you're reading a text, right, a Buddhist text, and it talks about the alaya, right, and there's certain versions of Lojong texts that'll say rest in the nature of alaya, right? Like there's in the 7 point, there's certain versions of the 7-point mind training that have a line, rest in the nature of alaya. So now I'm just pointing out, if you've studied tenets, oh, okay, this author is coming from a Chittamatran perspective, and particularly a Chittamatran perspective of those following scripture, right? And who teach bodhicitta, and so that makes sense, isn't it? Like, so that particular author, and that at least when he's writing that part, is coming from that perspective. And that's a valid Mahayana perspective, right? It's one of the Mahayana sub-schools of tenets. So I'm just pointing out, once you've studied tenets, you can have a sense of where an author is coming from. And one thing that I see Tsongkhapa says, which I just think, I'm just pointing this out as a kind of side point, but his approach is that when teaching from a certain tenet system, you should teach from that tenet system. Does that make sense? So like, in other words, like if you're having a text that's a Svatantrika text, it should be a Svatantrika text. Later, if you want to refute aspects of that, that's fine from a Madhyamaka perspective, say, or something. But to be consistent, he sort of asserts this idea of being consistent. It's another reason why also, like when you see, so that's just a general point. But okay, then this next bit is the same as the lower schools, right? There are two types of awareness: valid cognizers and non-valid cognizers. That's the same as other right? So those are, and remember, valid cognition is pramana, the pramana, and then is non-pramana cognition. And there are two types of valid cognizers: direct valid cognizers and inferential. And it'll describe more about those later, so I'll just keep going. Sutra middle way autonomous do not assert self-knowing direct perceivers, right? And we've talked about this before, so just remind you that's in same as the Sautantrikas, right? Sautantrikas don't assert self-knowing direct perceivers, so they follow the Sautantrikas. Yogic middle way autonomous assert all four types of direct perceivers. Self-knowing direct perceivers, yogic direct perceivers are necessarily non-mistaken consciousnesses, while the other two, sense direct perceivers and mental direct perceivers, can either be mistaken or non-mistaken. So just briefly, right? So that's pointing out that, why is he pointing this out, right? Because when he's talking about ways of asserting object possessors, all the rest is the same, right? But here, where he's again bringing out there's a difference between the Sutra middle way autonomous and the yogic middle way autonomous. Because again, the Sutra middle way autonomous follow the Sautantrikas and do not assert self-knowers. Yogic middle way autonomous follow Chitamatrans and so do assert self-knowers. And and again, this is the same as the other schools, right? That self-knowing direct perceivers and yogic ones are correct, are non-mistaken, whereas the other two, right? And you remember, because like sense direct perceivers can be mistaken. For example, if there's a cause of error, right? If you have a temporary cause of error, if you have a disease that causes you to see things in a mistaken way, that's a sense direct perceiver that's mistaken, right? And the same can apply to a mental direct perceiver. And then he makes, and remember I said, so he points out, again, most of this otherwise is the same as the lower school, so he's not going to go into huge detail, but now he's going to point out the points of difference. So he says, proponents of Sutra, proponents of mind only, and autonomous all accept. So these are points that, these are points in common with all three, right? So Sautantrikas, mind only, actual Sautantrikas, actual mind only followers, and Sautantrika Vajramikas all accept the following: that a direct perceiver is necessarily a consciousness free from conceptuality, right? Because that's what a direct perceiver is, right? It's a non-conceptual direct, so visual consciousness is they're saying it would be an example, right? If you see the color blue, that's a sense direct perceiver that's non-conceptual, right? The eye consciousness in blue is an example there. Then it says, they all agree also that a subsequent cognizer is necessarily a consciousness that is not a valid cognizer. And I want to point out why, because remember, part of the definition of pramana or valid cognition is a new incontrovertible knower, right? The subsequent cognizer is not new, right? It's subsequent by definition. That's what the term it's saying, right? So it's not a new awareness, it's a subsequent awareness. So therefore, to those schools, it would not be a valid cognizer. He's pointing out partly because it's something these three schools all have in common, and it's also just I'm bringing up that that's something that again Prasangikas do not have in common with them. Prasangikas say it doesn't matter if it's new or not. If it's incontrovertible, it's pramana. So it's a point that's different from the Prasangika perspective, but these three, Sautantrikas, Chitamatrans, and Sautantrikas all agree on that point. Then a consciousness that is mistaken with respect to its determined object is necessarily a wrong consciousness. And so I want to point out something here. I just want to differentiate something here, just to make clear what the sentence is getting at. So here it says determined object. The last of you see there are like these bullet points. The last of these bullet points at the end in this section, it says with respect to its appearing object, right? So there's two different things. This section is pointing out there are two different things: a determined object and appearing object. And That's this translator's use of the terms, but what it's getting at here is, say this right, that there can be a difference between the appearing object and the determined object. And what that means is this, is, let's say it the right way. The appearing object to a conceptual consciousness, right, is a meaning generality, right? I've used that term before. It's a mental image, you could say. Right? A meaning generality is like a mental construct. So to a conceptual consciousness, the appearing object, so I'm going to give an example here. If I think of a car, right? What comes to mind, the appearing object is the mental image of a car, right? Like if I close my eyes and think of my car, I have a mental image of my car, right? So what's the appearing object to that consciousness is the meaning generality of a car. That's what the technical term would be, right? The mental image of a car. The determined object by that consciousness is the actual car. Does that make sense? Is the car itself. So one point I want to point out is, in order to understand these sentences, you have to understand those are two different things, right? So if I have the mental image of a car, and you know, we pointed this out before a little bit, but you know, if I'm stuck, you know, if I'm in, you know, if my car is in Virginia and I'm in New York, I have the mental image, like I have the meaning generality of my car that can appear to my consciousness, right? But if I want to drive to Connecticut, it won't take me there, will it? It's a meaning generality, right? It's not a functioning thing, right? Whereas the determined object is the actual car, meaning the functioning thing that you can drive in. So there, again, so there are two different things, right? Especially for a conceptual consciousness, the appearing object and the conceptual is the appearing object to a conceptual consciousness is a meaning generality. The determined object is the actual thing. So now we can see a consciousness that is mistaken with respect to its determined object is necessarily a wrong consciousness, right? So now you understand what that's saying, right? So in other words, if it's wrong with regards to it, the actual thing itself, then it's, if it's mistaken with regards to that, then it's wrong, right? You understand that now. So and what's important though is this, is part of what they're getting at. I'm going to jump down to the last one and compare the two. So I'm going to skip a couple of bullet points, then we'll come back to them. The last one is, if it is an inferential cognizer, it is necessarily not a valid cognizer with respect to its appearing object, and so on, right? The reason for that is this. Like a conceptual, what they're getting at is this, is if I have a concept, let's say I have a meaning generality image of my car, going back to my example, right? And if I think, it's actually interesting, just like look at how the whole process goes, right? Actually, this morning, there are signs out on my street that say, on Tuesday, they're going to do milling and paving. So I have to move my car, right? So by Monday night, or else I don't get towed. So the reason I'm saying that is this, is if I think, right, look, if you think, like, so this is, everybody does this all the time now, right? So, I mean, it's just part of normal human existence. So if I'm sitting in my house and I think of my car, the meaning generality of the car arises in my mind, to my mind, and I think, oh, I've got to remember to move my car on Monday, right? The determined object of that consciousness is the car, right, itself. And that consciousness is not mistaken with regards to its determined object. The car is there and I can move it, right? So it's unmistaken with respect to its determined object. It is mistaken with regards to its appearing object. Why? Why is it? See, that's what I'm saying here, is it's necessarily not a valid cognizer with respect to its appearing object. The reason why is that the appearing object is not an actual car, but I confuse it with the car. Like when I think oh, that's my car, I actually think that's my car, right? But it's not. I don't think, oh, this is my mental generic image of a car. I think that's my car, right? And so inferential cognitions are not, they're not valid with respect to their appearing object because they confuse the appearing object with the actual thing. But they can be correct, but they can be correct consciousnesses if they're correct with regards to their determined object, right? So if I think my car is black, right, that's correct with regards to it. If that's a valid conscious or unmistaken with regards to its determined object, the car is black. If I think it's but it's not a valid cognition with regards to its appearing object because what's appearing to my consciousness is not a car, so it can't actually be black, right? It can't be a black car because it's not a car, it's a generic image or a mental image of a car, a meaning generality. The appearing object is a meaning generality of car, so it's not a car, so it can't be a black car, if that makes sense. So I think that does. Yeah, so that's what this is getting at. So a consciousness, now we go back. Now I think you can understand this sentence. A consciousness that is mistaken with respect to its determined object is necessarily a wrong consciousness, right? And so an example there, right? Like if I were, I'm going to give an example. If you imagine that a person is a bodhisattva, right? And then I get upset with that bodhisattva, which is bad karma, right? And then I think, oh, they're a bad person, right? So my point is, in that moment, I'm mistaken with regard to the determined object, right? The actual person is a bodhisattva, right? But my consciousness is labeling them a bad person, right? That's mistaken with regards to its determined object. Right? Now, it's also, what's appearing to my mind is also a meaning generality of that person, right? So it would also be mistaken because the meaning of, actually it's part of the problem, right? The meaning generality that's appearing to me actually is not particularly related to that person in that case, right? So it's a distortion. So in that case, both the appearing object and the determined object are mistaken with regards to, right? Whereas if I think of a bodhisattva and I think they're a wonderful person, they're a compassionate person, then it's a valid consciousness with regard, it's valid, or it's unmistaken, that's a better way to put it. It's unmistaken with regards to its determined object, right? It's correct, that person is a good person, they're compassionate. Still though, I'm confusing the meaning generality that my consciousness has of them with the person in and of themselves. So there's still an element of the appearing object is still, I'm still mistaken with regards to mistaking the appearing object as if it is the determined object. But we can be correct. The point here also is, one point is you can have correct consciousnesses with regard to that determined object, right? When I think the car is black and it's black, that's correct. If I think a compassionate person is compassionate, that's correct with regards to its determined object. Right? Anyway, do you get I just want to make sure that people understand. So there's a difference though between the appearing object and the determined object. We don't usually think that way, actually. So that's why I'm just pausing on this point. Actually, and part of the reason I'm pausing on this point also is, this seems like what's the word? A little bit, when I first read these ideas, it seemed like a little bit of an arcane Buddhist epistemological issue. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've decided that it's not. Like, that the problem is that sort of, if you think deeply about this, what I've started to become disturbed by actually is the recognition that, it's right, most of what I do in life is confusing appearing objects with determined objects. Like, and so whether it's people or things, right? Like I have all these appearing objects, which are my concepts, right? Like conceptual images, conceptual ideas about things. And all the time I'm confusing them with the determined object. Like I'm thinking that they accurately represent the things in and of themselves. And the problem is actually, there are two different problems. One is, and I think it's worth contemplating. One problem is the appearing object to a conceptual consciousness is necessarily not a valid cognition, it says here. It's never completely correct because it's a mental image of the thing. It's not the thing itself. That's one problem. And if you check your own experience in daily life, what you'll find, what I've found anyway, is when I do it, which I don't always do, but is, wow, all the time I'm mistaking that. That's disturbing, right? That's one point. Then there's a second point, which is what this sentence we're actually focusing on is getting at, which is, and often it's not only is it mistaken because it mistakes, not only is it problematic because it's mistaking a conceptual image of a thing for the thing itself, but it's often distorted, right? It's often not just wrong about that, but it's often also completely wrong, right? Because like I'm thinking that things are one way, and it's even wrong with regards to its determined object, right? So I think, oh, this is great, and what I think is great is actually not great, right? Oh, I think this is going to be a source of so much meaning and it's meaningless, right? Or I think this is going to be wonderful and it's not wonderful. I think this person is like this and they're actually like that. And so this, again, this point about determined object versus appearing object, I'm just dwelling on a little bit because I think you could read it and go, oh, I don't know, it seems a little philosophical or something. But it's actually a very deep psychological point about how we experience things and how we distort, or how we get them wrong, how we're mistaken with regards to the things of our actual lived life. Yeah. Okay, and then I'll just cover the other two or I guess just one more bullet point. It says here, if it is a mistaken consciousness with respect to a phenomenon, it is necessarily not a valid cognizer with respect to that phenomenon. Well, that's kind of what I was just talking about, right? So in other words, and actually, I just want to ask you a question about that, just to contemplate. Because this is getting at object possessors, but another way of putting that is it is also what we're talking about here is valid cognition, right, or phenomena. And so I guess it's just worth thinking about. Let me see this right. So when are you having a phenomena? Like when are you having a valid cognition? And how do you know? And that's what this is really, prominent. I just think it's a humongously important topic. And what Buddhism is saying, what Buddhist epistemology is really the right term, pramana studies is saying is, if you say, oh, I never know, it's, you could, so in other words, if you say, on the one hand, we naively often feel that everything I perceive must be true, that's wrong, right? It's not the case. But it's also not the case to just say, well, then nothing is prominent, right? Nothing is valid. No, that's wrong. That's incorrect also, right? What this is saying is there are valid cognitions and there are mistaken cognitions, right? Sorry with that. There are valid cognizers and non-valid cognizers. One version of non-valid cognizer is a mistaken consciousness. And Buddhism is saying these are points that are knowable. This can be determined in your own experience. Anyway, and so I'm just putting in a plug for, I guess, studying pramana, like that there's a humongous benefit in studying pramana because you can understand then, how do I know what's mistaken in my own experience? And when am I making mistakes? And when is the mistake just that I'm taking the appearing object to be the determined object, right? Which is one level of problem. And when is it actually, and that would be a non-valid cognition, right? And when am I even mistaken with regards to the determined object? Like, so I'm so distorting that I think, something that's even inaccurate with regards to the determined object itself. And actually, if we all just did that, oh my goodness, like what a better world we would live in, right? If we all just worked on, trying to know when we're wrong with regards to the determined object, we would live in a much better social reality with each other. And not just social reality, but planetary reality, right? Because our making, what's the word? Being mistaken with regards to the determined object is how we end up with all kinds, like wars, right? Come from that. I mean, all kinds of problems come from that. you know, ethnic and racial conflicts, also the environmental crises we're in, to a large extent come from this, right? Buddhism would say all those things come from mistaking having mistaken consciousness with regards to the determined object. And so, so when the Dalai Lama points out, he often says, right, like peace begins with inner disarmament, right? That's this work, actually. Like, it's not some other thing, right? That's this. That's like actually going. Yeah, actually, I mean, it just. I'm going, and then I'll stop. I'll just say, well, just yesterday I was like, just yesterday I noticed I woke up like in a bad mood. I was agitated. I was sort of annoyed. I woke up just in an annoyed mood, and then it took a little while. I was like, oh, I noticed, oh, I'm kind of feeling not just for whatever reason. I noticed that. I mean, I noticed that was there. And then I was just doing this. I just started laughing. I was like going like, oh, wow, like this is appearing to me as if it's negative, but that's not true. Like I would pause and think about it. I was like, that's totally distorted. Like, I'm thinking negatively about this person, but actually they're a good person. I'm thinking negatively about this event, but it's actually a positive event. And I started like laughing because I was like, oh my goodness, because I'm in this mood, I'm like, having all these mistaken consciousness because everything is appearing to me as annoying because I'm annoyed, but it's wrong. And then, of course, by laughing at it, I got less annoyed. And I'm just pointing out, like, that's applying the Pramana teachings in real life. Does that make sense? Like, because we do that, right? In that case, I was mistaken with regards to the determined object, right? I was seeing things in a distorted way. And then it's more subtle when you can recognize that you're also not having a mistake with regards to the appearing object, right? Mistaking the appearing object for the thing itself. Anyway, so that's that's an advertisement for Pramana, and Pramana is wonderful because it actually applies to the daily life, right? To how we perceive. Anyway, I went on and on about 2 sentences, but I hope that's useful. And then the next section is number 6, the ways of asserting selflessness. Right. So the first paragraph here says, the person's emptiness of being permanent, unitary, and independent is asserted to be the core selflessness of persons, while the person's emptiness of being a self-sufficient, emptiness of being self-sufficient, substantially existent is the subtle selflessness of persons. So I want to point out actually something which is, that is the same, right? Actually, that's the core selflessness of persons, right? So the conception, actually I'm putting out a chart here I have, just to sort of say this clearly. So the conception of being a permanent, unitary, independent person. I want to point out when we covered the Vaibhashikas, right, the lowest of the 4 tenet systems, it was the same, right? I said then to a Vaibhashika, a Sautrantrika, a Chittamatra follower, a Yogacara Svatantrika, and a Sautrantrika Svatantrika, the course self of persons, which doesn't exist, is the conception of a permanent, unitary, independent person. So all those tenet systems, not including the Prasangika because they're different, but all the other tenet systems would agree that the core self of persons, which must be negated, is the conception of a permanent, unitary, independent self. And also all of those schools would say that is an acquired, not an innate object of negation, call it. Right? So that object of negation is something that we acquire due to learning, due to learning a wrong tenet, learning an incorrect view. It's intellectually acquired. One point that I'll just say is that acquired views, right, acquired wrong views, we can learn them in this life, right? Like, as if you go to school and somebody tells you there's, if you go to a school and somebody says there is a permanent soul that's, was created, whatever, and exists for all eternity, unchanging, well, then you learn a view that from a Buddhist perspective would be a wrong view, right? But according to Buddhism, it's also possible to grasp that this core self as a person is due to wrong learning, or learning an incorrect view in a past life. So you can have like seeds of wrong, karmic seeds of wrong acquired views that then ripen in a future life. So both are possible. So it could be, I'm just pointing out this, so this grasping at a acquired wrong view of a permanent, unitary, independent self can be something learned in this life, or something that you grasp at due to karmic propensities from previous lives. Both are possible for yourself or other people. It doesn't matter. So anyway, so that grasping at the permanent, unitary, independent person is an acquired wrong view that can be acquired in this life, or can have been acquired in past lives and be a habit that you engage in. And realizing the emptiness or the lack of that is realizing the coarse selflessness of persons, according to, I'm just pointing this out, that I'm just sort of, because we're at the end of that, of the schools that hold that. All those schools, not every Buddhist tenet system, not except for the Prasangika, say that's the coarse selflessness of persons, is the emptiness of that. And that's what this, first half of the sentence is saying. And then it says, right, while the person's I'm just read it again. While the person's emptiness of being self-sufficient and substantially existent is the subtle selfless of persons. And again, that there are different ways. I mean, I was going to share this now, but so this conception of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person is the emptiness of that is the subtle selfless of persons, again, for all those schools as well. I'll add in, though, that the different schools will have different phrasings around. The point being that the self-sufficient, substantiation person for all the schools is the root cause of the mental afflictions. Right? That's what the mental afflictions arise from, according to all these. All these schools actually agree on that. And so, so they have different ways of phrasing this, but to put it, I'm going to leave it simple in a sense. What all the schools would say is, in order to become, all the schools from the Svatantrika, Madhyamikas down, right, to the mind only, and the Svatantrikas and the Vibhashikas, they would all say, to become liberated from suffering, you must realize the subtle selflessness of persons, which means you must realize the emptiness of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, and thereby eliminate, you could say, the retinue of that, or you could say the accompaniments of that, or the things that go with that, which are the three poisons, right? Like so, and the other mental afflictions. So by realizing that selflessness, you eliminate craving and grasping and hatred and pride and jealousy and so on. And by, eliminating all of those mental afflictions, you eventually achieve liberation from the cycle of birth and death, from samsara. So anyway, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Is that all those schools have a similar presentation on those points. As we'll see, the exception, which we'll get to, is the Prasangikas. They have a different way of talking about this, which we'll get to in the next section. But all these other schools agree on those points. And now I want to remind everybody, right? So then those two types of selflessness are pretty, very similar, right? Are phrased the same way in all these different tenet systems. But then next is going to come the selflessness of phenomena, right? How do these schools present that? And I want to point something out, which is, remember though, so the selflessness of persons is presented very similarly in all these schools up to this point. Selflessness of phenomena is not, right? Because do you remember? I just want to point out, it's like a review, right? The first school that we studied, the Vaibhashikas, they don't talk at all about it. They don't present a selflessness of phenomena. Remember? They don't even, that's not a teaching of theirs, right? It's not considered relevant. They don't discuss it. Also, the Sautantrikas don't discuss that, right? It's not a tenet of theirs. They don't talk about a selfless phenomenon. They only talk about the subtle, the gross and the subtle selfless of persons. They don't present a selflessness of phenomena. So only the Mahayana tenet systems, right, present a selflessness of phenomena. And then the first school that presented a selflessness of phenomena was what we studied just recently, the mind-only school. Right? And for them, what was the selflessness of phenomena? This is a review, right? For them, there were two versions of the selflessness of phenomena, right? One was that external objects are empty of existing as separate entities from the nature of mind. That was one kind of emptiness of phenomena. And the other kind of emptiness of phenomena for them was that external phenomena are empty of existing by way of their own entity as the reference for our terms and concepts about them. Yeah, that's the other that's the other presentation of emptiness of phenomena for Chitamatrans. Right, and so they were the first school to teach an emptiness of phenomena in this, of the four tenet systems. So now we're up to the Madhyamikas, and Madhyamikas for sure teach selflessness of phenomena, right? And so now we're going to get into, so what is the let's grab the top shot. So now we're getting into what is the Svatantrika Madhyamaka presentation of the selflessness of phenomena. And the next paragraph actually says, it is addressing the yogic, right? Yogic middle way autonomous, or Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka. And before I read that sentence, I want to point something out. Because we just talked about the coarse and subtle selflessness of persons, right? The previous sentence addressed that. So now, of all the Mahayana schools, only one teaches a coarse and subtle selflessness of phenomena. And that's the one we're about to cover. So all the other Mahayana schools don't talk about a coarse and a subtle selflessness of phenomena. They just teach selflessness of phenomena. There's one school, which is this one that we're about to cover, that teaches both a coarse and a subtle selflessness of phenomena. So they're the yogic middle way autonomous are the only one, and they're just unique in that presentation. And this sentence gets at their coarse one. So it says, yogic middle way autonomists assert that a form and the valid cognizer apprehending that form's emptiness of being different substances is a coarse selflessness of phenomena. So what we're getting at here, right, is that this makes sense. The yogic middle way autonomists tend to follow the Chitamatrans, right? So what they're saying is what the Chitamatrans assert to be the selflessness of phenomena, they say is correct, but it's the gross selflessness of phenomena. Does that make sense? So there is what they just mentioned is the Chitamatran, one of the Chitamatran views, right? That form and the valid cognizer apprehending it are not different entities or different substances. They follow the Chitamatrans. So they say the Chitamatrans are correct on that, right? That an external form, for example, and the mind apprehending it are not two separate substances, and the emptiness of their being separate substances is an emptiness of phenomena. But because they're Madhyamikas, they say that's a gross level of emptiness of phenomena, right? Because they're going to say there's even a subtler thing, which Chitamatrans don't say, right? That's why they're subtler than Chitamatrans. So they say that is the coarse selfless of phenomena is what, one way of saying it is what Chitamatrans hold to be the subtle selfless of phenomena, or the only selfless of phenomena. the only level, not just course, but there is the Chittamachans would say that is the selfless phenomena. Yogic middle way autonomous would say that's the gross level, right? There's something deeper because they're Majjhimikas. So they would present the Majjhimika stance as the more subtle. Does that make sense? That because they follow Chittamachans, they're asserting that the Chittamatra view of selfless phenomena is a selfless phenomena, but it's not the subtlest one, because they're, we'll get to what their view of the subtle. And actually their view of the subtle one is the next sentence. So they say, all phenomena's emptiness of true establishment is asserted to be the subtle selflessness of phenomena. Right. So for them, that emptiness of being, the emptiness that's a lack of subject and object existing as two separate entities is the gross selflessness. But the subtle selflessness is the lack of true existence or true establishment. And so that's subtler for them. And that's what makes them Majjhimikas, right? That things lack true existence to them. And I mentioned this last week, like one example of how that's subtler, right, is that a Chittamatran would say the table is empty of existing as a separate entity from the mind. That's its emptiness, right? But a Chittamatran would not say the mind itself is empty, right? They would say the mind itself is truly existent. Whereas here, right, read this sentence again. All phenomena is emptiness of true establishment, right? That includes the mind, right? So a Yogacara Svatantrika Majjhimika is different than a Chittamatran in that they would say the mind itself lacks true existence or lacks true establishment. And so you can see how I mentioned this last time briefly. I think it was a question that Sujata raised. I mentioned this, like that's a difference, right? That for these Majjhimikas, even the ones who follow the Yogacara or Chittamatran general doctrine, a difference is they say all phenomena lack true establishment. That includes the mind, for example. And that's an important distinction, right? From a practice perspective. They say mind is empty. Chittamatrans would not say that. That mind is empty of true existence. So they're the one school that presents this kind of gross level and then subtle level of selflessness of phenomena. Yep, Lynn has a question.
Is there the subtle selflessness of phenomenon? Is that because there's a merging of the mind and the object? So they don't appear separately because they're merged, they're together.
Do you mean is that why they would say that there's a subtle selflessness?
Well, is that a way of thinking about it? Maybe that's what I'm asking.
What I would say is not necessarily. Let me play it out and sort of see if this addresses it. Like, because one point is that mind only school, right, would say ultimate truth is the experience of ultimate truth is an experience of without duality. It's a non-dual experience. So they would also say, so Chittamatrans would say the experience of ultimate truth is a how do you say it right? Is an experience without duality. So on that point, like a there is the experience experientially that there's an experience of non-duality in the experience of ultimate truth. Chittamatrans and these Majjhimikas would agree on that. So I don't think that's what differentiates them. Does that answer? Like,
well, what does differentiate them? How do you think about that?
I thought that's where you're
maybe that's the way. Maybe that's the question.
What differentiates them is that like, I guess I would say it this way. Like, so think of it from a practice, like when if you're a Chittamatran, right, and you're meditating on say the emptiness of your own body, right, you would recognize at a certain point that the mind apprehending form and form are not separate entities. It's empty of us, and there will be a negation. You would realize how you grasp at your hands or something, or your body as existing. Yeah, like for example, it's very profound in a way, right? Like, think of it this way: like, if I were going to have a medical procedure done, there would be an anxiety that would come, right? Like if I was about to get an operation or something, right? There would be some feeling of anxiety. That's a grasping at the body. It comes from the grasping of the body as mine, right? And they would recognize very profoundly, right, that like, oh wow, that grasping at the body as existing as some kind of independent entity separate from consciousness, it's actually empty. It doesn't exist in that way, they would say. And then there could come a point where you would negate, in meditation, you would negate that wrong concept of the body existing as a separate entity, and you would abide in this kind of non-dualistic state of where the mind would just be totally immersed in this wisdom, understanding that the body doesn't exist as a separate entity from consciousness. So that would be from their perspective, that would be an experience of non-duality, realizing an emptiness, the emptiness of, in that case, the body existing as a separate entity from consciousness. Here's the difference. Like a Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka would say that is a correct meditation on the emptiness of phenomena, but it's a gross one. And what they would say is, now look at the consciousness itself. And on some subtle level, there's still a grasping at true existence of the consciousness. You haven't negated that. So it's still, on some subtle level, there's still a kind of subtle grasping at consciousness itself as existing truly. And then they would say, this is what a Chittamatra would not do, but this school would do, is they would say, okay, now look at your experience of that consciousness. Does it exist truly in the past? Does it exist truly in the future? Is there something you can grasp at in the present that and hold on to that's a truly existing consciousness? No, right? Consciousness only exists. Let's see if this is right. Consciousness exists from their perspective. They would say, dependent upon a label, dependent upon, both that which is clear and knowing from its side, and then the consciousness labeling it. But it's empty of existing truly, which for them would be independent of the perceiver, right? And so they would say consciousness itself is also empty. That is something a Chittamatra wouldn't do. And then they would rest in a different, they would say this subtle selflessness is subtler in the sense that you're even negating the true existence of consciousness itself. And then they would say, then they would non-dualistically rest in that state. So that would be the difference, is that a Chittamatra wouldn't question whether consciousness, or they would say the consciousness, they wouldn't not question it. They would just say consciousness is truly existing. So you can't prove an emptiness of consciousness because it's not empty in that sense. Whereas Svatantrika Madhyamikas would say it is empty.
But that would mean, if you say consciousness is not empty, that assumes that that's separate, it's dualistic. There's a dualism there, that if it's not empty, then it's not the object.
Yeah, and what's interesting,
I mean, it seems like if you hold on to consciousness as separate, as a perceiver, as separate from the object, then there is a dualism. Maybe not the dualism that most people walk around in the world thinking, but it seems dualistic. Whereas the other it merges them together in a way. I mean, that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, and I think, I don't think it's said exactly that way, but I think you're right in the sense that that would be like what you're saying would be a kind of like a Madhyamaka critique of the Chittamatran position, right? Like I know actually you can see how Madhyamaka might say to a Chittamatran, well, you're saying it's non-dualistic, but you're still saying there's consciousness and emptiness. Aren't those two things? Isn't that dual? Whatever. They could sort of critique that. And I'm not sure I'm going to say this correctly exactly, but a Chittamatran would say, Chittamatra could say, well, everything's in the nature of mind. So that's not dualistic, but a Madhyamaka would critique that, right? And would say, oh, you're subtly still grasping at something, right? At mind as truly exists. So that what you're getting at is a correct sort of thinking about a difference between the Chittamatra, and I think, yeah, so I think you're on the right track to contemplate that and go, oh, wow, that's what you're getting at is a difference between the Chittamatrans and the Yogacara, Svatantrika, Madhyamikas. I think you're in the territory of that difference. And again, though, just to summarize, though, so from a Chittamatran's perspective, they would say, no, that's not dualistic. It's just you're realizing the emptiness of external phenomena, and you're resting in the nature of emptiness or something. What you're getting at, though, is a Madhyamaka critique of that, which is there's still a subtle grasping, there's still a subtle dualism, therefore, and that you have
it's like a grasping at the mind. It's a grasping of consciousness.
Yeah, that would be the Madhyamaka perspective, and that's why, from a Madhyamaka perspective, from a Yogacara, Svatantrika, Madhyamaka perspective, there's a subtle level of selflessness that still has to be realized at that point. I think you're getting at just the point here. That's why they say there's a gross and a subtle level of selflessness from this sub-school's perspective, is they would say you must realize that subtle level of selflessness to achieve Buddhahood. Because otherwise there's going to be a kind of subtle type of grasping. And dualism that would keep you from becoming an omniscient Buddha. That's actually what you're getting at, would be this school's perspective on, that's why until you realize the emptiness of mind itself, you can't become an omniscient Buddha, because there's still some subtle level of grasping. So I think that is the schools. That's why they teach a gross and subtle level. And that's why they differ from, that's why they don't, in the end, they're not Chittamatrans, they're Madhyamikas. Is that, yeah. So, from this school's perspective, I think you're right, that there would still be a kind of subtle dualism there. It's very subtle, though, isn't it? You can see how that's a very subtle level of, it's why they call it gross and subtle. It's like, it is a very subtle distinction. But this school is saying it's a very important one, because you won't become a Buddha if you don't realize it.
I also have the sense in the back of my head that, how do I say it? That I'm thinking in a Western way about Buddhist concepts, that there might be another way of looking at it that makes it easier to understand.
Yeah, that may be. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe.
Because I don't see the mind-only school at all as being non-dualistic. It seems very dualistic to me. The mind and what you see. I mean, I don't see that as non-dualistic at all. I don't sense it. I don't know. I don't understand it that way.
Whereas from their perspective, for sure, right? They say ultimate truth is a non-dual. They would say the ultimate experience of ultimate truth is non-dualistic. Yeah. I don't. I mean, I'm not sure, but I guess I'll just say I do think these are good questions. I just want to encourage. I think it's great to ask those questions, though. Like, how do my own what's the word? How does my own background influence how I'm perceiving this? And is it making it harder for me to, to perceive what they're saying accurately? And and what are to what extent can I understand what they're saying from their own, like what Asanga is saying from his own perspective, or what what any of these philosophers are saying, I mean, not just Asanga, but these different philosophers, what Dignaga is saying, or what, what they're saying from their own perspective. And I guess I will say one other reflection on that, Lynn, for what it's worth, is like, one is, I think that makes sense. I think to some extent, we can't help but be influenced by our, whatever our background is. And at the same time, I think, if one gets really interested in a certain if you want to go, if at a certain point one wants to go more deeply into a certain part of Buddhist philosophy because one's interested, I personally think that this is part of what I was saying. Actually, I implied this earlier, but I just want to say it more explicitly now because I think it relates to what you just said. I think to me that's part of what I love. Not just Tsongkhapa, but actually again, I mean I know the Gelugpa tradition best because it's just the tradition I've studied the most. But one thing that I've noticed with those scholars is if they're studying I'm trying to say this the right way. I would take the example of even a lower school, Swatantrikas, right? The Swatantrika position. They really, when they're studying that and teaching Abhidharma and studying, say, Abhidharma, they really embody that position. And they sort of will only, they won't, they'll debate from that position. They'll view the world from that position. They'll meditate from that position in order to really integrate what it has to offer experientially, I think, intellectually, but also experientially, and then they'll go on to do Madhyamaka. And there's this, and so I guess from, as an American person, I don't, my Tibetan is not good enough. I can't go debate, and hang out at the monastery and do debates in Tibetan, but I will say, any other thing, if you read deeply, when you read a book by somebody, or if you read a few books, what I say with any topic, if you read 3 or 4 books by the same author, you sort of get a sense of their worldview, and you really can kind of enter their perspective for a while. And I find that's possible. I find that's possible with these other schools. So in other words, if you got interested in the mind-only school, there was a point when I did that, Jeffrey Hopkins translated 3 or 4 big thick books of mind-only stuff. And there was a period I was okay, I'm going to read all of those in a row, and then read Bob Thurman's translation, and then read another translation by, I think, McGee of Tsongkhapa's text. And my point is by doing that, you kind of enter that perspective for a while. And then it helps to really go, okay, wow, this is, because part of it is there are times where, relating to what you said, there are times where I'd be reading something, I think, why are they even asking that question? Somebody would ask a question, a mind-only philosopher would ask a certain question, and I'd be I have no understanding why they would ask that question. That doesn't make sense to me. But then I'd have to go, wait a second. This person who's asking the question is one of the great philosophers of all time of that school. I'm not. They're probably asking the question for a good reason. If I don't understand why they're asking it, then I'm missing something. And there were times where I remember going back over the same question 5 times, going, okay, what's the answer to the question? And then why would they have asked it? And finally going, oh, now I understand what they're from their perspective, they're asking that question because of this. And I guess I'm just saying that I think that's, if one wants to move out of one's own, it's limited still. We're always going to be influenced by our own history, but I just think that for me, that is a useful way. I mean, just now I'm doing it about a different topic, but to really enter into the texts is sort of entering into dialogue with that person or those people in that tradition, and trying to sort of get, what are the questions you would ask if you're in that position? How would you meditate if you're in that position? What would be your doubts? How would you answer this? If somebody argued against you, if a Madhyamaka said this, what would you say back from a mind-only perspective? So those are the questions that they raise anyway. I was really struck by that. It actually got me very moved at one point where I was Jeffrey Hopkins had already published all those books on Prasangika view. And at one point I remember thinking, why in the world would he publish now book after book after book on the mind-only school? And it's not his final position philosophically. And then I get it though. I'm right. There is if you really, there's to do what we're describing, wow, he really entered the world of the mind-only philosophers and raised their most subtle, most difficult points, and then I can actually look at him and think, oh, now he's somebody I know understands my Prasangika perspective, because he explored them, and he wrote whole books on other positions that I know he would disagree with ultimately, I believe. And I'm not saying we need to do all that, but I'm just saying that's a way of entering into the world of the other in a way that pulls us out of our cultural, at least to some extent, out of that, whatever our own history is or something. Oh, Sujata has her hand.
Lynn and I often have very parallel questions. It's the lawyer training. And I like this parallel sort of concern about hangups. And, you know, because I have the Hinduism hangup where I can't, and I know I've asked you this question in the past and I'm just still really struggling. And I've gone back and looked at my notes and I can't seem to find the difference. Okay, so going back to the Chitta Matran, so you were using this explanation that the mind and the body are not separate, and how a Chitta Matran might meditate on that non-dualistically. And I'm just having a really hard time not see where is the non-dualism in that. If the mind is, and I think, well, this, I don't even know how to articulate this question, because I think I'm also still having confusion about the difference between truly existent and inherently existent. So they're having trouble even articulating this question. I've been really confused today through all of class. It might just be that my brain is not functioning well today, but I'm having trouble seeing the non-dualistic position of the Chitta Matran differentiation between, you know, external objects versus the mind. And then I'm having trouble seeing sort of the subtler thing that this version of it, the Madhyamaka, what this division of the Madhyamakas accept of the Chittamatra view versus what is that subtler level, because I don't think I'm understanding. I think I'm not understanding how that first level exists in the first place, the Chittamatra position. Is my question making any sense at all? I'm so confused.
Let me start with it and see. Let's go a little bit back and forth, because I'm not sure if I'm going to fully get. I mean, let's try to explore it together a little bit.
Okay.
Because one thing is this is I'm trying to go back to. Because what the first question, because the way you're asking two different questions. The first one is like, in what sense you're exploring, kind of in what way. Let's put it this way. Like, I'm going to go back to like it's an interesting point. Like, maybe I'll say it this way. Actually, let me see if this starts to get at it. I'm going to first do the mind-only perspective for a second, right? Because from a mind-only perspective, emptiness, right? The emptiness of phenomena. Let's focus on that, because that's the point. That's the unique point. Otherwise, it's similar to the lower schools. So from the mind-only perspective, the emptiness of phenomena, using the terms we were just using today, it's the same term, would be a non-affirming negation, right? Also. And actually, so to think about it this way, though, then what is actually, and it's an important point, I guess, to differentiate in a way from the lower schools. So I just want to explore this together. I'm sort of trying to think it through and try to explore a little bit, right? Because so it's a non-affirming negation is one point, right? And actually to think about what's being negated, right? What's the object of negation to this, from this school's perspective, right? And so I'm just sort of reflecting on this myself, actually, to sort of contemplate. Because I mean, actually, there are numerous objects of negation from the school, right? They negate, I mean, as the other schools do, they negate permanent independent self, they negate a self-sufficient substantially existent self. But then they also negate a self of phenomena, right? And what they say is there comes a point in terms of the non-dualism when you have negated a self of phenomena and are therefore in this kind of absorption, right, on an emptiness. And from their perspective, that's the ultimate truth, right? Is the experience, actually, because ultimate truth is actually an experience, right, for them, for all these schools, of meditative absorption on a non-affirming negation, which is the negation of a grasping itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, so let me pause there. Now, so if you take it in those terms, then like, can you like specify your question in those terms? So like, where's the dualism that you're seeing in that? And then maybe we can look at it. Yeah.
So the dualism is in at that moment of experience, I don't see the dualism. But when the position is asserted that the mind itself is not empty of inherent existence, that's where my confusion arises about the dualism. Although I think I just solved my Hinduism problem, which is where well, in the basics of external existence is illusion, which is a very different thing than a non-affirming negation. So if the external world is a non-affirming negation in the Chittamatharan view, then in the Hindu view, the Maya is a very different, like this external reality, or even our bodies, everything, all the aggregates, all of that is Maya, right? And so that's just very, illusion is a completely different, it's a pure misapprehension as opposed to a non-affirming negation. Those feel different to me now. And so that's one distinction that I can draw. I'm still having difficulty drawing a distinction between, particularly when we move into the Alaya Vijnana, and the distinction between Alaya Vijnana and, I mean, I see how they've broken down the, the Klistamana, the Alaya, like those are different, but, and how those are sort of just conceptually in some ways different than the idea of an Atman, where the karma sits on the Atman and goes, it just feels like different labels for the same thing. I'm still having a real difficulty distinguishing that. I mean, you were very clear last time, and that's the only thing that stuck in my mind is that there's the value of the Chittamatharan view in deepening our understanding, and how it is subtle and extremely distinct from Hinduism is something that has been said and asserted, right? And I have trouble understanding that distinction when I consider the non-emptiness of the mind as being so different from a Vedanta view of a soul. How is mind stream that different from a soul? And the external world now, that the differentiation is a huge difference, actually, and important to see as a distinction. But I think that I have this fear of sliding into Hinduism, and I think that when you ask us to look at our hangups and sort of where our concerns are, that's a big concern for me. That I want to be sure not to go down that road again somehow. And so that I'm noticing my mind having some sort of big block and fear almost, and my incapacity to differ. I'm like, no, that's that other thing that I don't want to do again. Right. And so, so I'm trying, so it's just noticing that psychological hang up that is causing me to have difficulty differentiating between these two. And so on the one side now I see a huge difference between the view of the external world in these two schools of thought. But but I'm still having a lot of difficulty understanding how we get to non-dualism if there's still this conceptualization of an inherent existence of the mind that is in these deep absorptions with non-affirming negations. Like I can't, that piece is really, how is it non-dual if the experiencer or the engager in the absorption is existent, but the things with which it is engaging are non-affirming negations? That's my confusion.
That's a very interesting question to think about, like, isn't it? Like, well, I'll just say a couple. I mean, I'll say just a couple of thoughts. Like, one is, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, from a Chitta Matran, a couple of things I'm reflecting on. Like, one is, so one thing is that you were kind of implicitly differentiating between the Chitta Matrans following scripture and the Chitta Matrans following reasoning, because of the alaya part. And so that's the Chitta Matrans following scripture, right? And a few things, I guess. So, like, one is, like, I mean, just to say a couple quick points. One is, so they don't, those Chitta Matrans don't assert that the alaya is permanent. They would say it's impermanent, right? They would also say that, and I said this once before, I think, that they also would say that because the alaya really is functions as the repository of karma, and they sort of assert it has to exist because karma can be positive or negative, and the mind, how does a negative mind, all that, we've covered that. But from their perspective, the alaya itself, let's put it that way, ends at enlightenment. That's a difference also, I think, in the sense that it's not it's not something that sort of you're trying to, what's the word, achieve, or that is a kind of enlightenment. Actually, it's something that actually ends at the time of enlightenment, because it's no longer an accumulation of karma. Well, actually, the karma is purified and it's no longer accumulation of karma, so there's no longer that. But yeah, your other point, I mean, I'm just sort of hesitating because it's kind of what Lynn was getting at, right? That there is a kind of valid criticism, in a way, from a Majjhimaka perspective but from the Chitta Matran's own perspective, it's an interesting question. Like, because from their perspective, I suppose the key point is that they say if things, actually everybody who's not a Prasangika says this, right? Only the Prasangikas are different, but all non-Prasangikas, going back to your point about inherent existence, all non-Prasangikas say if there's nothing that has any inherent existence, then that's nihilism, right? Then nothing functions, because from their perspective, there are things that lack inherent existence, but they would be imputational natures, right? Or that lack true existence, let's put it that way, that lack true existence. Like, so from their perspective, imputational natures do lack true existence. But from their perspective, they would actually say, if you say everything lacks true existence, let's use that term. From their perspective, they would say, if, so they would say if the mind lacked true existence, there would be nothing functioning to realize the ultimate truth. Would be their perspective, because they would say it's a functioning thing, right? So therefore it has to have true existence to function, like it was because it produces effects. But yeah, and they would certainly say it's not eternal, it's not, it's not permanent, it's not. That's interesting. Well, and one last, I don't know if that probably doesn't fully answer your question, but I just want to make one last, to your second half of your question, I'll just remind of one thing from last time, right? Because now going to the Madhyamaka perspective, but the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka perspective, I just want to remind you of the object of negation, right? Which is true existence for them. I'm going to use that term, which is established by way of its own uncommon mode of existence without being posited through the force of appearing to an unmistaken consciousness. And I just want to point out from a Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka perspective, it's getting a little wordy, but that's the core difference, really, is that for them, apply that to consciousness now, right? So for a Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka, consciousness itself is not established by way of its own common mode of existence without being posited through the force of appearing to an unmistaken consciousness. So in other words, in what sense does consciousness exist? It exists because it appears to an unmistaken consciousness. And it's empty of existing without appearing to an unmistaken consciousness. So for them, that's the emptiness of mind, just to be clear, and that's different than the Prasangika's view of what it is. But right, for them, I just want to say that again, because I think that's a subtle distinction, right? And actually, I'm going to say it this way. I'm going to read the Lankavatara. I read this last time, but I'm going to read the Lankavatara Sutra, but now apply it to mind, right? Because we're looking at it from this perspective. This is the Lankavatara Sutra, which Svatantrika Madhyamaka often quote. I'm going to add here. All phenomena, I'm adding now, including mind, exists through appearing to consciousness. All phenomena exist conventionally and don't exist ultimately, including mind, right? So mind, from this school's perspective, mind is empty of true establishment because it's empty of existing without it's empty of existing from its own side without being posited through the force of appearing to an unmistaken consciousness. Well, I have one more point actually, which is intriguing. Some philosophers of this school of the Svatantrika Madhyamaka actually use this term. They'll say it's merely labeled, right? Which is the same as what Prasangikas say. But what they mean something, right? Prasangikas mean it's merely labeled. It has no existence from its own side. This school, when they say merely labeled, they mean it has no existence from its own side without appearing to an unmistaken consciousness. So they would say mind itself is, I just want to, that's the meaning of emptiness from this school's perspective. Mind is empty of existing by way of its own, from its own side, let's put it that way simply, without being posited through the force of appearing to mind. And so how does mind exist? It exists conventionally because it appears. But actually, I do want to say one last point just about the earlier question that maybe is also worth thinking about. Is also just in terms of the Chittamatra. Is it okay if I jump back to the Chittamatra perspective, or is that going to be confusing? Okay. I do think it's worth also noting something from the Chittamatra perspective, which is to differentiate between, like, okay, so actually this is an important point too, right? From a Chittamatra perspective, part of how they would talk about they say ultimate truth is non-dualistic, right? It is a non-dualistic experience. And for them, mind, actually it's an interesting point, isn't it? Is like, I'm sorry, say this right. Mind is a conventional truth for them. Right? And so actually, in that sense, I think it's an important distinction, going back to Lynn's question also, that from a Chittamatra perspective, this might be an important distinction to make, actually. mind is truly existent, but it's not, from a mind-only perspective, mind is truly existent, but it's not an ultimate truth. And so that means that from a mind-only perspective, in the experience of ultimate truth, it's non-dualistic. When you come to conventional truth, you experience a functional mind, therefore it's truly existent. But it's an important distinction that, mind's true existence that is an important distinction to make. From the mind-only school's perspective, in other words, Madhyamaka would say mind is not truly existent. But a Chittamatra would say mind is truly existent and it's a conventional truth. But mind is not an ultimate truth. Ultimate truths are emptinesses. So that would be part of how they would say the experience of ultimate truth is non-dualistic, is that while in the experience of ultimate truth, no conventionalities are appearing, including mind from their perspective, right? Because ultimate truth, as they would say at that time, it's an important distinction, right? For them, that if you said, is mind truly existent? They would have to say yes, right? But they would say, but it's not an ultimate truth, and so it's not appearing in the experience of ultimate truth because it's not an ultimate truth. What's appearing in ultimate truth is emptiness. Yeah, and it's similar in a way. They would also say that anger is truly existent, right? A mind-only follower would say anger is truly existent because it serves a function, right? It can lead to negative karma, which leads to lower rebirths, whatever. So they would say anger is truly existent, but it's not an ultimate truth, and it doesn't appear when they experience of ultimate truth. In the same way, mind is truly existent, but it's not an ultimate truth, and it doesn't appear. So that's part of, I think, how they would say, how is the experience of ultimate truth non-dualistic, is that conventional truths don't appear to that consciousness. Anyway, it's a lot to think about. I know we're just almost out of time, but Larry, do you want to do your question briefly, or?
Yes, I'll do it as a comment because I'm not about to get into the discussion of mind-brain. I was listening to as people were asking it, but as having taught mind-brain, mind-body, whatever term we want to use, and then reading this, one of the things I'm trying to do, and you made a good point a while ago about reading other authors that have written about the subject, because they're going to have subtleties in their interpretation or the way they explain it. And as having taught philosophy and studied philosophy for a long time, this is a subject that when you talk about consciousness and mind and brain and body, they're terms that you need to be really clear on what the definition of them are, or you get really confused about it. And what I'm thinking as I'm reading through this is I'm trying to focus on and I'm going to use the word mind or consciousness interchangeably, though I know friends of mine that might argue a little bit, there are subtleties involved, that's more what I'm, to me, the cognitive part that we identify, like anger, you mentioned that we don't see anger. Anger is not a thing that we can pick up and do anything with. We see a consequence of a brain function. That's what I'm calling it now. I know psychologists would disagree with that too. But I guess my point is, and I'll get to the end of this, is that it's a very complex subject. To me, if I try to focus on my Buddhist reading and don't intertwine it with my reading of Heidegger and other people like that, it's very clear. But if I try to go back to the debate that we philosophers have, it's a never-ending debate. We've been doing it for 2 millennia. We've not got an answer yet. The Buddhist perspective on it, to me, is much simpler to understand. And there are subtleties in the different schools that we've talked about. And it simply, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is which one do we best understand and that we can work with? So I'll stop at that because I'll drag it out a lot longer if I don't. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. You raised interesting points too. Wow. Well, maybe I'll just, I know we went over a little bit. I'll just say a couple quick points and then we'll stop. But I want to say, actually, it was good because one is, I think it's great we're having these discussions, you know, and these discussions, these points, and you know, actually, I was thinking about this yesterday, that there's not a, you know, I mean, I just sent, I don't know if Gabe posted it yet to the website, but I just sent the schedule for through like mid-November for classes. You know, and I sort of sent, I think 3 more or something, and I was like, wow, I don't know if we need 3 or 4 or 5. We don't, you know, there's not a lot left to the text in terms of the text itself. The implications are humongous, as people are pointing out, these comments and questions. And so I guess I just want to say a couple points. One is, like, you know, one is, we'll sort of see how that goes with the schedule thing, but I want to leave room for people to have these back and forth, because I think this is part of what makes it a rich experience. And I mean, I'm learning from y'all, and I hope learning from each other, and, you know, we're all learning from. So one thing is, I want to encourage, like, especially as we go on to the final parts of the text, for people to raise questions and have more discussion like this, because I think it's good. That's how we learn, really, is processing it on our own, and then with each other too. So one point I want to make is, just as we go on to these final sections, you know, we've been doing that all along, but I want to make sure we do pause for people to kind of share their own reflections and questions and observations is one thing. And then, you know, and I'll set aside time for that, just because it's not a hurry, right? There's no rush. Doesn't matter what pace we finish this at, from my perspective. But anyway, so there's that. And but yeah, so if you have like complex questions like this, just write them down, think about them, bring them in. We'll have more discussion. I think that's a good thing. And people can kind of share back and forth. And then, you know, we'll still also cover the text and the text from its perspective. But I think it's good for people to share, because I really do think we learn from each other. And I certainly learned from questions myself. But so I wanted to say that point. And then 2 other quick things I want to just mention before we stop. One is, and I'll keep mentioning this now each class. One is, FPMT has said that they really do want people to get like completions. That FPMT likes it when people get, if people do a whole program, a whole text in the basic program, they like for people to have a completion certificate for that. And I think that's good. It's like just sort of honoring the commitment that you made in studying the topic. So each class now, I'm going to say, in these sort of, as we get to the last few months of class, at some point, send me an email for everybody who's done. I mean, I know in many cases you guys have been, you all have been to most of these classes, but I want to compile a list of everybody who's sort of if you've attended most of the classes, and some people I don't know, they've been watching them online when they miss. You know, some people have been here for half the classes but have watched the others online. So I want to compile a complete list, because at the end I want to give everybody a completion certificate from FPMT. They just think it's a good thing to do, and FPMT has asked that, and I think it's a nice thing. And, you know, someday it might be useful if you want to do something else with FPMT, or if you want to have a prerequisite for some other study or something, that can be useful. So I do want to do that. And then also, not yet, but I mean, in 2 or 3 classes from now, I'll also start asking for feedback on if people want to study a different text next after this, you know, or starting next year. So I'll be open to feedback, because and so far we've been doing basic program, and so we could continue with, there are a lot of texts that have not yet been covered in the basic program, or other things, whatever. So I'm open to feedback on that, especially like probably in late October and November to start, because usually we need some lead time to like figure out what will the text be, and then, you know, or what's the topic, and then I'll locate the right text and figure out, you know, plan. So I don't want to sort of do that in the last class, because that's not a good way to approach it. So I'm starting to mention it so that by late October, people can sort of give feedback if they're interested in something particular. And what we've done in the past is just like, if a few people are interested in a certain topic, then we do that topic. So that's how we'll do it. But anyway, there's still more to go on this text, but I just wanted to mention those things for now. But and anyway, if Gabe hasn't, I gave him this week the dates for 3 or 4 more classes. So if Gabe hasn't posted, I'm sure he will soon. I'm not sure if he did or not. But that we should do our dedication. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Well, thanks, everybody. Oh, they are posted. Great. Gabe's quick. Thanks, and see y'all soon.